All right, I like to focus a little bit on that pharyngeal phase because that's the complicated bit. This is when aspiration occurs, is when this doesn't go right? When passing that material from mouth to esophagus past the trachea doesn't go right. All right, so we push the bolus back to the up and back to the soft palate. That stimulates the epithelial swallowing receptor areas, right, like we saw in that picture. Brainstem receives that, coordinates the output. Okay, so swallowing is entirely coordinated by the brainstem, all right, which means if your brainstem is damaged, you're going to have feeding problems, okay? Now you're going to have other problems too, but among those you're going to have that problem. All right, so what happens? First up, the soft palate is pulled upwards towards the brain. Why? It blocks off the posterior nares. Now you haven't done the head in anatomy yet, but you've got holes in the front for your nose, you've got holes in the back for your nose too, right? Because the air has to pass through and down. So the soft palate goes up to close off the holes in the back, right? So that we don't inadvertently put food material into our nose, right? Now some of you have done that probably, or seen people do that. That is an error in the swallowing system, but it can occur. Because human beings do crazy things like laugh in the middle of swallowing, right? So then it all goes haywire and food goes everywhere, right? All right, so soft palate pulled up, closes off the posterior nares. Then the palatopharyngeal folds, which sit on each side of the pharynx, are pulled together, right? So they're pulled closer together, and it forms a kind of slit that food has to pass through. This helps to exclude things that weren't chewed up very well, right? So it has to be small enough to fit through the slit, or else it just comes back into the mouth. Okay, then the vocal cords are closed really strongly. We call the structure at the top of the trachea the glottis. Have you looked at the neck yet? Anatomy? Okay, you will. All right, so the glottis sits at the top of the trachea, right? When we breathe, it's open like this. When we talk, it's closed, but not entirely, and then these vibrate, right, as we push air through it. When we swallow, they close really tight, all right? To such an extent that unless you have worked to create conscious control over this, you cannot breathe while you are swallowing, okay, because your glottis is closed, all right? This does make sense. You never think about it because your brain is just managing things on your behalf, right? But you don't breathe while you're swallowing. Okay, so those are closed. The larynx is also pulled up towards the bottom of the jaw. We saw that in the picture. That helps to change the angle between the esophagus and the trachea. So basically it puts the opening to the trachea out of reach, up and out of the way, so food can't get down there. Okay, that helps. Both of those help to prevent aspiration. So the entrance to the larynx is covered, blocked, and therefore preventing aspiration. Now, the upward movement of the larynx, okay, so as the larynx comes up, that actually moves the esophagus sort of forward and down, and that opens the entry to the esophagus. So while we've taken the airway away, we've put the food way in right exactly where we want it in this process, okay? So now the opening in the esophagus is perfectly lined up so that food material can come down. Now, esophagus is a smooth muscle tube, right? It has a sphincter at the top and a sphincter at the bottom. The upper esophageal sphincter is the one at the top. Now, if you go looking for this in the anatomy lab, you're not going to find it. It's a functional sphincter. It isn't like a separate structure. It's just this area of smooth muscle stays contracted all the time. So it's effectively closed. Why? It helps prevent air from going into the digestive tract. Now, that's not going to hurt you, but if you get enough of it, it's going to make you uncomfortable, right? Because we don't digest gas. Gas just has to pass all the way through, right? So the upper esophageal sphincter is usually closed. At the right point in swallowing, when the material is coming down, the brainstem opens it, right, so that it can enter the top of the esophagus, and then it closes again. All right, so that functional sphincter opens, allowing the material in. Then, once all these things are in position, right, so the larynx is raised, the esophagus is open, everything's there, only then do the pharyngeal muscles throw that bolus across that weak spot in a hurry, like we saw in that picture. Hopefully you saw how quick that pharyngeal phase was compared to the other parts, right? So then the pharyngeal muscles do their thing and move it past. So this is complicated, right? You've got a bunch of cranial nerves involved, 5, 9, 10, and 12. All have to be working right in order to have swallowing work as evolved. The tractus solitarius of the brainstem is the fancy name for the swallowing center, right? Or I'm sorry, the tractus solitarius of the brainstem, and then the medulla and lower pons also have components of the swallowing center. Can you tell I'm not going to ask you the brain parts, right? Because that's for later, that's for neuroanatomy. Then, while all this is happening, the brain also inhibits respiration during swallowing. Okay, so typically, there's a 3 to 6 second pause in respiration when swallowing is triggered. Now, there again, things go wrong. You know, something funny happens, right? And you move your respiratory tract and it all goes haywire. But typically, respiration is inhibited during swallowing. So that's the pharyngeal stage. It's the complex bit. And it is the part that clinically this is the hardest to work with, right? Because it is involuntary, but it's also complex. So there are experts in swallowing, right? Both for adults and for children. Because in babies, a lot of times swallowing is feeding, right? So if a kid isn't gaining weight, having trouble feeding, we have to send him to a swallowing expert to assess what is wrong. All right, then we get to the esophageal stage, and here it's peristalsis. Okay, so it's that classic moving the egg through the stocking kind of a thing. Primary peristalsis is the way food normally moves from the top of the esophagus into the stomach. Okay, that's the typical. Now, sometimes things don't work quite right, and let's say food doesn't go all the way down. Okay, it gets sort of stuck midstream. Distension in the esophagus, so in that area that's stuck, becomes distended. The response to that distension is a secondary peristalsis, which is much stronger, often even painful to the patient. You know, like you'll feel an almost tightness in the esophagus. But what it's doing is it's correcting the problem. It's forcing that material down into the stomach so that it doesn't stay trapped there. Material that's trapped in the esophagus for a long time is going to cause inflammation and potentially rupture of the esophagus. So we don't want that. So primary peristalsis is the typical, secondary is the backup plan. Okay, so the esophagus is unique in the GI tract because not all of it is smooth muscle. Okay, you know, the mouth and the pharynx aren't smooth muscle either, but they're shared between the respiratory and GI tract. The esophagus is a GI organ, but the first third of the esophagus is skeletal muscle, not smooth muscle, skeletal muscle. Now, what's interesting about that is, first, it's innervated by the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves. Now, what's interesting there, skeletal muscle sends signals to the brain to tell the brain what is happening. So it means that at the beginning of swallowing, at the first part of food heading towards the stomach, we're consciously aware of that, right? But then it sort of disappears into oblivion and we never think about it again. Well, what has happened? The distal 2/3 is smooth muscle. So when the skeletal muscle ends and the smooth muscle begins, we no longer receive any information about that, and so the brain doesn't know what has happened. So it kind of explains the disappearing food. You know, like we swallow and we can feel it go down, but then after that it's like, well, I guess digestion will happen, you know, because we don't know anything more about it. So 1/3, 2/3. I have also heard this stated as 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Okay, where 1/3, the first third is skeletal muscle, the second third is mixed smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, and the distal third is smooth muscle. Your book talks about it as distal 2/3 is smooth muscle. So you may hear me slip up and say 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But that's what I'm talking about. Essentially, between the skeletal part and the smooth muscle part, there's a mixed part, right? Where they're both in there. So there's a transition zone.